Well, next I want to introduce you to Flannery O'Connor. A lot of people read the name Flannery and they think it's a guy, but it's not. Flannery O'Connor is an author from Georgia. I think one of the best short story writers of the 20th century for sure. She wrote novels and short stories. She was educated in Iowa at their very, very famous school for creative writers. Took her MFA there and then moved back to Milledgeville, Georgia, and that's her house down there. If you're ever through Milledgeville, you can go visit the house. She was very fond of peacocks, and some descendants of her original peacocks still roam the grounds there. She's a very, very beloved figure. One of the things that you'll find out about O'Connor is that she really wanted to write short stories and novels that took a very long, hard look at the society that she grew up in, Southern society. This is someone who was writing in the 1950s and early 1960s particularly, and she was very disturbed by the segregation that was going on at the time, and particularly focused a lot of her attention on sort of middle-aged characters who were white and who seemed oblivious to persecution, to other things. They thought that they lived in a good world and everything was wonderful and perfect and right, and for them it probably was. But she really wanted to show us characters who had to go through some sort of awakening experience, and you see that certainly in this story. The first thing I want to do is start off with and by the way, O'Connor was a very, very religious person as well, and so she believed that you know, sometime in our life, if we're ever going to be enlightened, spiritually or otherwise, we sometimes have to go through trauma. We sometimes have to go through difficulty and suffering so that we can understand and see more clearly, and that God actually does that too. That's the purpose of suffering, is for us to come to some greater awareness in some cases. So bear that in mind as we get to the end of the story. Take a look at the setting. Once again, very important. This entire short story, except for the end, most of it, takes place in a single room, a box, if you will. That's what rooms are, is boxes, really. And it's really interesting because all the different characters in the room represent sort of some different, you know, element of society at her time. Sort of small town, Georgia, southern, semi-rural society. You've got Ruby Turpin and her husband Claude. Claude's kind of a thickhead. They're in there because a cow kicked him, and he pretty much does whatever Ruby says. Ruby calls the shots. She even, you ever notice this? There's even a phrase that she uses. She said, the narrator says, she and Claude. That's an odd grammatical construction. It really should be Claude and she. You almost always put yourself at the end of it, but it's she and Claude, which is kind of an interesting, subtle way of saying who really calls the shots in that relationship. She has her husband, and he pretty much does what she says. Then there's the white trash lady that Ruby just absolutely detests. Never mind how offensive the term white trash is to a lot of people. She uses it because that's what Ruby would say. Ruby would say the words white trash. She will use racially offensive terms like nigger. She'll use all kinds of things. And here's the thing. Here's the kicker. She has no idea how incredibly mean-spirited, how incredibly bigoted it is. She just thinks this is what you say. She's oblivious to the impact of those words and how they might make another person feel. Then there's the pleasant lady, who clearly is on Ruby's social standing, right? She's up there with Ruby, and Ruby thinks that she and this lady have a connection, right? Because they see the world the right way. And then there's Mary Grace, who is this sad, unfortunate young woman who clearly is mentally disturbed and very unhappy. And we'll find out more about Mary Grace later on. Notice the name Mary Grace, very interesting. O'Connor was Catholic, and so you read into that name whatever you want to, but Mary Grace is the one that really gives her a whack upside the head, doesn't she? Notice how Ruby constantly uses cliches, and so does the pleasant lady. A cliche is kind of this tired, old, worn out phrase that you might use to say some things or point some things out. And you know, bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, takes one to know one, those kinds of things. And what it's an indication of is sort of unoriginal thought. It's an indication of a person uses a lot of cliches, that they don't do a lot of thinking for themselves. They just, sort of copy and cut and paste what other people think, right? So it shows what kind of mind she has. And we find out early on with some selections in here just how Ruby approaches the world, and we get to look around the room and see the social classes that exist, and it's quite telling. You see, this is on page 728. Mrs. Turpin put a firm hand on Claude's shoulder and said in a voice that included anyone who wanted to listen, "Claude, you sit in that chair there," and gave him a push down on the vacant one, as if he were accustomed to doing what she said. She's positioning themselves physically so that she's physically removed from the less desirable people, you see. I let her gaze settled agreeably on a well-dressed, gray-haired lady whose eyes met hers and whose expression said, "If that child belonged to me, he would have some manners and move over. There's plenty of room there for you and him too, right?" "My," the pleasant lady said. "How did you do that?" "A cow kicked him," said Mrs. Turpin. Right, poor old Clog got kicked by a cow. And then she and the pleasant lady engage in just ridiculous, frivolous small talk. "I wish I could reduce," right? She needs to lose weight. "Oh, you aren't fat," the stylish lady said. Stylish lady, pleasant lady, whatever. "Oh, I am too. Claude, he eats all he wants to and never weighs over 175 pounds. But me, I just look at something good to eat and I gain some weight." "Well, as long as you have a good disposition," the stylish lady said. "I don't think it makes a bit of difference what size you are. You just can't beat a good disposition." Next to her was a fat girl of 18 or 19 scowling into a thick blue book which Mrs. Turpin saw was entitled Human Development. Hey, that's no coincidence that it's titled Human Development, because the story is about her development as a human, and is she going to, right? At the end, she's knocked for a loop. At the end, will she learn from this? Will she become more enlightened? Will she change the way she views other people, or will she not? We're left hanging there. Poor girl's face was blue with acne, and so on and so forth, and Mrs. Turpin herself was fat, but she always had good skin. Okay, so there's gospel music in the background, and that's important too. A lank-faced woman, this is the white trash lady, who was certainly the child's mother. She had on a yellow sweatshirt and wine-colored slacks, both gritty looking, and the rims of her lips were stained with snuff. She dipped snuff. Her dirty yellow hair was tied behind with a little piece of red ribbon. Worse than niggers any day, Mrs. Turpin thought. The gospel hymn. Now look, watch. She uses that offensive word right there, okay? And remember what I said. O'Connor wants you to see these people the way they really act and the way they really talk, and she's not going to sugarcoat their language. If this is a racist, she lets you know what that racist thinks and says in those terms. So don't be mad at O'Connor, be mad at Ruby Turpin, because it's Ruby who's thinking this way. But look, right after she says such a mean-spirited thing, look at what happens. The gospel hymn is playing, "When I looked up and he looked down," and Mrs. Turpin, who knew it, supplied the last line mentally. "And one of these days I'm going to wear a crown." "Oh, you think so, Ruby? Using terms like that? Racist terms like that? You're going to wear that crown? Is that right?" But there's irony there that's unbelievable, right? So she thinks this horrible racial epithet, and then she's just oblivious to it, and she's just singing the rest of it about how she's going to heaven, right? All right, so she sizes up all these people, and notice how she categorizes people by their shoes, which is a weird thing to do. And look at the conversation she has with Jesus before she's born. She says, "Sometimes at night, when she couldn't quite go to sleep, Mrs. Turpin would occupy herself with the question of who she would have been, who she would have chosen to be if she couldn't be herself. If Jesus had said to her before he made her, 'There's only two places available for you. You can either be a nigger or white.'" Now, okay, first of all, imagine a Jesus that would use that line. It's just a twisted view of Jesus. This is not the Jesus I know. Or white trash. What would she have said? "Oh, please, Jesus, please," she said. She would have said, just let me wait till there's another place available." And he would say, "No, you have to go right now, and I have only those two places, so make up your mind." She would have wiggled and squirmed and begged and pleaded, but it would have been no use, and finally she would have said, "All right, make me a nigger then, but that don't mean a trashy one." And she would have made herself, and he would have made her a neat, clean, respectable Negro woman herself, but black. I mean, this is just dripping with horrible irony. Like Jesus would ever actually say, oh, I'm going to use this term and describe people like this. So she categorizes all of these different types of people, and it doesn't fit. She can't quite figure out in this great hierarchy of things why some things don't seem to fit. So, for example, there's a dentist in town who's African American, and she's like, why does he have all the things he has? That violates my sense of order of the universe. That's just not right. Some things just don't fit, right? And she can't understand why all these things are roiling around. And look at what she says. This is scary, really spooky. Top of 731. Right? When she talks about the dentist, there's a colored dentist in town who, oh, by the way, back in the day, colored and Negro were not considered derogatory terms. Now they are. But at the time, that's, I mean, NAACP means National Association of Colored People. It was the preferred term. Today, it's not. But so there, you know, this is the narrator saying there was a colored dentist in town who had 2 red Lincolns and a swimming pool and a farm with registered white-faced cattle on it. Usually, by the time she had fallen asleep, all the classes of people were moiling and roiling around in her head, and she would dream they were all crammed in together in a boxcar being ridden off to be put in a gas oven. What? Okay, that is phenomenal. In other words, she's like half asleep. I don't know. I can't figure it out. I'm so sleepy. Let's just gas them. Oh, my Lord. Okay, this has got to be O'Connor saying, okay, the origin of people who tolerate genocide is this kind of thinking right here. That's where this comes from, right? This is how people in funny uniforms with funny little mustaches take over countries and do horrible, ghastly things to people because people like Ruby Turpin let them. So she goes on, and she's finally confronted, of course, classically by Mary Grace, who lets her have it. Did you notice, of all the cliches, the one that's the most interesting is the one that's unspoken. It's acted out, because Mary Grace literally throws the book at her, right? That cliche of to throw the book at someone, she literally does it. And what's the book she throws? A book called Human Development, okay? And then, of course, she tries to choke her and everything. And this brings us to the sort of the pattern that you see in this one, this short story, and you'll see it in the next one that we're going to cover next week. There's always a pattern in some of these stories where O'Connor has a protagonist who encounters a dilemma or a challenge to her worldview, right? So she thinks she's got it all figured out and the world is all perfect and fine and I've got my little space and I've got my little pigs and I got my little farm and I got my little Claude and everything's working great for me, but there's something not quite I can't figure out about the world, and I try to think about things in the way that I was brought up to think about them, okay? And she responds conventionally to that with her cliches or her way of thinking or the way she does it, but then something happens in the short story where somebody violently confronts her with her way of looking at the world and with her conventional thinking. And then the story pattern ends with that protagonist having to think about, what does all this mean? Why was I, at the end of this short story you see it too, where she's like, why did you send me this message, God? She knows. Ruby knows where this came from. Ruby's no fool. Ruby knows that this wasn't just some girl named Mary Grace who lost her temper. Ruby knows, right? She may think, I've got the world figured out, 98%. I just can't put the black dentist where he belongs, but everything else is all figured out. I've got the world all figured out, and I know how to live my life, and I'm very sure of my salvation and everything. But by golly, deep down, when this happens, she knows who sent this message. She knows it wasn't just somebody named Mary Grace. She knows it was God, and it was God's way of saying, wake up, Ruby Turpin. You are not all that. You are not all that. And in fact, you're very wrong. So the character has to figure out, what does this violent action mean? And I use the phrase, the occasion of epiphany, because in the Catholic Church, they have this phrase called being on the occasion of sin, right? You haven't quite sinned yet, you're just kind of thinking about it, okay? So, there's like somebody else's chocolate bar on the desk there, and you know it doesn't belong to you, and you're kind of looking at it, and you're thinking, what would it be like to eat that chocolate bar? Because I'm really hungry. I know it would be stealing, and I haven't stolen it yet, but I'm really, really close. You see? So that's being on the occasion of sin, right? It's something you need to back off because you shouldn't do it, right? Walk away. I use this term, being on the occasion of an epiphany. An epiphany is an awakening or a realization, a profound revelation, right? Hence the name of the story, Revelation. She's had something revealed to her. But the short story ends without you being able to see Will she act on it? Will she change? Will she see the world differently because of this? We don't know. It's in her court. She can decide. We're not. It doesn't give you the wrapped up bow package and pretty little package of, and she changed her mind and became a good lady after this and never was phony to anybody again. Notice her relationship with the black folks that she works with. The world she lives in, she thinks she's got it all figured out. But it's superficial and it's shallow. She doesn't really like the African Americans who work for her. And if you think the African Americans really do like her, that these workers really like her, you're wrong, because they don't. Because once they drive off, you can bet they're saying things like, that stupid old lady, I can't stand her guts. It's phony. It's a sham. And that's what O'Connor's trying to reveal here, is that the people who want to maintain Southern society as a segregation society, they're living a lie. They're living a lie, because it's not a good society, and it's not one that's based on honesty and trust and respect and mutual admiration. And in fact, the people who most want to maintain it are a bunch of hypocrites. And they will tell you that they're the last thing from a hypocrite, but they are, because they think they're better than everybody else, and they're not, right? I mean, this is a pretty moralistic short story, but it's not done in such a way as to, like, preach at you. You get to see it unfold and unravel. But let's take a look at the setup to it. She gets walloped with this. Notice the back to Africa stuff, the really horrible stuff. The Mary Grace just gets a gutful of it and just can't take it. She's kind of in this ecstasy of self-congratulation. Well, don't make me that. Make me a good woman, and it don't matter what else, how fat or how ugly or how poor. Her heart rose. Jesus had not made her a nigger or white trash or ugly. He had made her herself and given her a little of everything. Jesus, thank you, she said. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Whenever she counted her blessings, she felt as buoyant as if she weighed 125 pounds instead of the 180, right? What's wrong with your little boy, etc. Look, and she's just going off, and on the bottom of 737, it's one thing I am, Mrs. Turpin said with feeling. It's grateful. When I think who all I could have been besides myself, and what all I got, a little of everything, and a good disposition besides, I just feel like shouting, thank you, Jesus, for making everything the way it is. It could have been different. For one thing, somebody else could have got clawed. At the thought of this, she was flooded with gratitude, and a terrible pang of joy rang through. Oh, thank you, Jesus, Jesus, thank you, she cried out aloud. The book struck her directly over the left eye. I love the change, the switch there. Bam! The book struck her directly over the left eye. Whacko! Right? Just as soon as she's yelling out, thank you, Jesus, for making everything the way it is, that's when she gets clobbered by the book. But then she has to come to terms with it. She has a vision. Now, you and I might say, well, maybe she was still a little bit woozy and dizzy from all of this, and she was hallucinating, but she goes out to scoot down the hogs, as she calls it, and she sees this vision off in the distance, right? She sees a vision, and this is on 745. She knows who sent this to her. She knows this message is from somebody, and she's angry at God. She's mad. The final surge, she braced herself for a final assault, and this time her voice rolled over the pasture. Go on, call me a hog. She's talking to God. Go on, call me a hog. Call me a hog again from hell. Call me a warthog from hell. Put that bottom rail on top. There'll still be a top and a bottom. A final surge of fury shook her, and she roared, who do you think you are? The color of everything, field and crimson sky, burned for a moment with a transparent intensity. The question carried over the pasture and across the highway and the cotton field, and returned to her clearly like an answer from beyond the wood. She shouts out, who do you think you are? And her own voice echoes back and says, who do you think you are? Right? Isn't that beautiful? It's brilliant. It's brilliant stuff. Her own words condemn her. Her own words accuse her. And in the final vision, at last she lifted her head. There was only a purple streak in the sky, cutting through a field of crimson and leading, like an extension of the highway into the descending dusk. She raised her hands from the side of the pen as a gesture hieratic and profound. A visionary light settled in her eyes. She saw the streak of as a vast swinging bridge extending upward from the earth through a field of living fire. Upon it a vast horde of souls, were rumbling toward heaven. There were whole companies of white trash, clean for the first time in their lives, and bands of black niggers in white robes, and battalions of freaks and lunatics shouting and clapping and leaping like frogs, and bringing up the end of the procession was a tribe of people whom she recognized at once as those who, like herself and Claude, had always had a little of everything, and the God-given wit to use it right. She leaned forward to observe them closer. They were marching behind the others with great dignity, accountable as they had always been for good order and common sense and respectable behavior. They alone were on key, yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away. In other words, it's a parade of people, souls going to heaven. Who's up front? Those who are lowest in society, those who'd been discriminated against, those who'd been made fun of. Who's at the back? The people who were supposed to be responsible and in charge. And she was responsible, and she was in charge, and she obeyed the law and all those things. But throughout her life she thought that made her better, and it didn't make her better. It made her last. Because she was given that authority, and she was given that responsibility, and she was given those blessings, and she was supposed to use them responsibly. And for the most part she did. But it didn't make her special, and it didn't make her better. It made her deserving to be at the end of the line, not the front. In a moment the vision faded, but she remained where she was, immobile. At length she got down and turned off the faucet and made her slow way on the darkening path to the house. In the woods around her the invisible cricket choruses had struck up, but what she heard were the voices of the souls climbing upward into the starry field and shouting, Hallelujah. Notice that all of them went to heaven, but her group got in last. Okay? So it's not as though O'Connor is saying this woman's going to hell. She's without redemption. She's without ability to be redeemed. But it is saying she's got a lot to learn because she thinks she's better. O'Connor, lots have been written on her theology, and she really was an adherent to a theologian named Teilhard de Chardin who wrote a lot about these things. And what she's saying is, you call yourself Christian, but you're not living like one. You really ought to read this guy named Jesus who said that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And you really should rethink about that. She's not condemning her. She's not saying you're going to hell. She's saying, you need to wake up, lady, because this isn't the way you're supposed to be living. Whether Ruby ever wakes up, we don't know. It's an open question. And she likes to end her stories like that, which I think makes them very, very interesting. We're going to see something fairly similar in the next short story when we get together, Good Country People, and we'll do that next week. Going to post the quiz and an opportunity to engage in some extra credit as well. Okay? So be sure you check in on the discussion board and the Blackboard.